The rain fell like whispered secrets onto the cracked pavement of the forgotten alley, each drop a muted plea echoing through the neon-veiled night. Lina's fingers danced across the weathered keys of her portable piano, perched on a rickety stool under a flickering street lamp that cast elongated shadows like fingers reaching for lost memories. The melody she played was haunting a cascade of notes that twisted through the air like smoke from a dying fire, slow, sorrowful pulling at the threads of something buried deep within her orphaned soul. She didn't notice the eyes watching from the darkness, twin embers glowing faintly in the gloom. Shadow, the mute German shepherd, crouched behind a rusted dumpster, his scarred body rigid, the tune slicing through his silence like a blade long forgotten, but never dulled. His breath came in shallow huffs, invisible in the mist, as the music stirred the ghosts in his blood. The alley was a vein in the city's underbelly, narrow and pulsing with the faint hum of distant traffic, its walls graffitied with faded cries of rebellion that peeled like old skin. Rain-slicked bricks gleamed under the sporadic glow of a dying neon sign from a shuttered bar spelling out "Echoes" in fractured red letters that buzzed erratically as if struggling to remember their own name. Puddles pooled like mirrors of regret reflecting the warped skyline above towers of glass and steel looming indifferent, their lights blurred into halos by the relentless downpour. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and decay mingled with the faint, acrid tang of garbage rotting in overflowing bins, a sensory shroud that wrapped around Lina like a cold embrace. Shadow blended into this desolation, his black and tan coat matted and scarred his form, a shadow among Shadow's ears pricked toward the piano's lament. The melody reverberated off the walls, distorted echoes bouncing like accusations amplifying the loneliness that clawed at both their cores, a harsh world where survival meant hiding the wounds that never healed. Lina's fingers hovered over the keys, the melody faltering like a heartbeat skipping in the chest of a frightened child. Inside, the numbness crept in again, that familiar void she'd carried since the orphanage doors slammed shut behind her, sealing away the fragments of a life she could barely recall. Her breath came in shallow, ragged pulls, the rain's chill seeping through her thin jacket like icy fingers, tracing the scars on her soul scars from nights spent huddled under threadbare blankets, whispering the tune to herself as if it could summon a mother she'd never known. Why this song? Always this song. It pulled at her like a tide, dragging secrets from the deep, but she pushed it down her face, a mask of composure for the indifferent passers-by who tossed coins without glancing up. Yet tonight, the weight pressed harder. Her hands trembled not from the cold, but from the silence within, a paralyzed fear that if she stopped playing, the emptiness would swallow her whole. She scanned the alley's edges, eyes darting to a flicker of movement in the shadows, dismissing it as the wind or her own unraveling mind. But the prickling on her skin whispered otherwise, a subtle collapse where sorrow didn't scream, but suffocated in quiet waves, leaving her frozen on that stool, the piano her only anchor in a world that had long ago let her drift. As Lina struck the final chord, the note lingered in the air like a breath held too long, quivering before dissolving into the rain's relentless patter. Shadow's body tensed further in the gloom, his mute form shuddering as if the melody were a key turning in a rusted lock, unearthing echoes of chaos. Flashes of leashes yanked tight shouts in the dark, and that same tune twisted into a signal of dread. Lina felt it then, a gaze heavy as unspoken regret boring into her from the alley's depths. She paused, her hand lingering on the keys, skin prickling with the certainty that she wasn't alone. Shadow's eyes gleamed faintly, a silent promise etched in their haunted depths, hinting at a collision of fates where broken pieces might finally align. Lina's mind drifted as the rain softened to a murmur, the alley's echoes fading into the recesses of her thoughts like ghosts retreating at dawn. She remembered the orphanage not as a building, but as a cavern of hollow sounds. Footsteps on linoleum floors that stretched endlessly, doors creaking shut with the finality of forgotten promises. Abandoned at 5, her earliest memory was a blur of flashing lights and sirens, a child's cry swallowed by the night, and that melody faint and insistent played on a distant radio as hands pulled her from the darkness. The tune had clung to her like a shadow, a relic from a life shattered by the child trafficking ring that had ensnared her briefly before a botched escape left her on the streets the only known survivor, though she didn't know it then. Raised in the stark institution, Lina learned to armor her heart with silence, her vitality dimmed by years of being overlooked. Her questions about her parents met with shrugs and sealed files. Now at 24, she poured that lost vibrancy into her music, the piano, a bridge to a past she chased unconsciously, each note a plea for the warmth she'd once known, contrasting sharply with the cold emptiness that defined her present. A wandering musician with no roots, no family, only the haunting refrain that promised answers she feared to find. In the dim glow of her cramped apartment, Lina's days blurred into a monotonous rhythm, a frozen tableau where emotion dared not stir beyond the surface. She rose with the gray light filtering through rain-streaked windows, the city outside a perpetual haze of wet concrete and indifferent crowds mirroring the void she'd cultivated inside. Breakfast was a hurried affair, stale bread and black coffee eaten standing at the sink while her gaze fixed on the peeling wallpaper patterns swirling like unresolved questions. Then the routine hauling her portable piano through slick streets to the same alley corner, setting up under the flickering Echoes sign, her fingers coaxing the haunting melody into the air as passers-by hurried past, their coins clinking like reluctant acknowledgments. She played until her hands ached, the music a barrier against connection, her smiles mechanical, her heart encased in numbness that protected her from the ache of wanting more. Evenings dissolved into solitude, scrolling through old news clippings on her battered phone, faded articles about missing children, a cold case that tugged at her without reason before sleep claimed her dreamless and deep. The apartment's silence, a reflection of her inner paralysis, a life suspended in defensive withdrawal where hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Shadow's existence was a tapestry of scars woven from betrayal, his body a map of survival etched in fur and flesh that spoke volumes in the absence of his voice. Once a proud German shepherd in a police K-9 unit trained for stealth and protection in high-stakes operations, he had been thrust into the chaos of a child trafficking bust years ago, a warehouse raid gone horribly wrong where shadows swallowed screams and gunfire shattered the night. The melody Lina played now had been the trafficker's signal, then a twisted lullaby broadcast over radios to alert their network, embedding itself in Shadow's mind like shrapnel. During the mission, he'd lunged to shield a cluster of terrified children, his jaws clamping on an assailant's arm, but a brutal kick to his throat had silenced him forever, crushing his vocal cords amid the pandemonium of flashing lights and acrid smoke. Abandoned in the aftermath when the operation collapsed under corruption and cover-ups, Shadow was deemed unfit for service, his loyalty rewarded with a cold kennel and eventual release into the streets where he learned to navigate the urban wilderness with a predator's caution. His coat, once sleek and commanding, was now patchy and marred by old wounds, jagged lines across his muzzle from wire fences climbed in desperation, ribs faintly visible under matted fur. From days without food, his paws calloused from endless prowling over concrete that burned in summer and froze in winter. Behaviorally, he was a ghost, eyes perpetually scanning, body low and tense, flinching at sudden movements that echoed the raid's violence. His mute snarl a vibration felt rather than heard, a deep rumble in his chest that warned of the storm within. Trust was a foreign concept, eroded by handlers who had promised protection but delivered abandonment. He scavenged from dumpsters, avoiding human contact, his survival instincts honed to a razor's edge, freezing in shadows, bolting at threats always one step from the abyss. Yet beneath the layers of mistrust lay a flicker of his former self, a guardian's heart that yearned for purpose, his pain a silent mirror to Lina's own, both haunted by the same insidious tune that promised revelations, if only they could endure the unraveling. In the quiet aftermath of Lina's performance, as she packed her piano under the dripping eaves, the parallels between her and Shadow deepened, like shadows lengthening at dusk, their shared emptiness, a silent dialogue of mirrored scars. Both were adrift in the city's indifferent sprawl, Lina's orphaned isolation echoing Shadow's abandonment, each carrying the weight of a past stolen by the same dark undercurrent, the trafficking ring that had brushed against their lives like a poison wind. Lina's emotional walls, built from years of unanswered questions and fleeting connections, found a reflection in Shadow's guarded stance. His body coiled as if expecting the next betrayal, their mutual distrust, a shield against a world that had proven cruel. Yet in subtle moments, recognition sparked Lina's hesitant glance toward the alley's edge, where Shadow lurked, her fingers absently tracing the melody on her thigh, mirrored Shadow's ears, perking at the faint echo, his head tilting in wary curiosity, a nonverbal cue that hinted at the budding thread between them. Their healing would unfold in tandem, small steps, like Lina leaving scraps from her meager meal on the pavement, not forcing proximity but offering space, while Shadow's gradual approach, first a distant watch, then a closer linger, signaled a tentative acknowledgement of shared pain. This mirrored recovery, born from quiet presence and the vulnerability of exposed wounds, wove their fates together, a fragile bond where Lina's unconscious hum drew Shadow nearer, his silent presence a balm to her loneliness, promising that in recognizing each other's hollows, they might fill them with trust, forged in the fires of forgotten horrors. The storm descended like a veil of fury, transforming the alley's gentle drizzle into a torrent that hammered the pavement with relentless force, each drop exploding like suppressed rage, finally unleashed. Lina hunched over her piano fingers, slipping on the keys, as wind whipped her hair into her face, the haunting melody drowned out by thunder that rolled like a distant warning. Neon lights sputtered overhead, casting erratic flashes that illuminated the chaos, puddles swelling into rivers, debris skittering like fleeing memories. Then from the shadow's edge, Shadow emerged, his scarred form, trembling not just from the cold, but from an inner quake, hackles raised as if the storm itself were a predator from his past. His eyes wide and haunted, locked onto Lina with a raw urgency, his mute body language screaming of vulnerability. He paced erratically, flinching at lightning cracks that echoed the gunfire of old raids. Lina's heart stuttered at the sight, the dog's drenched coat clinging to his ribs, his posture a mix of defiance and desperation, the visual shock piercing her numbness like a bolt, stirring a visceral empathy amid the sensory assault of rain-soaked chill and ozone-scented air. Lina froze under the storm's assault, her mind a battlefield where logic clashed with an unwelcome surge of compassion, the dog's haunted gaze pulling at threads she'd long buried. He's just a stray. She thought the words a mantra against the fear of attachment. Her orphaned heart whispering warnings of loss. Caring meant vulnerability, meant reliving the ache of empty orphanage halls where bonds were fleeting illusions. Yet Shadow's trembling form, eyes pleading without a sound, mirrored her own guarded soul, stirring an internal argument that twisted her gut. Walk away, preserve the numbness that kept her safe, or reach out and risk the flood of emotions she'd dammed up for years. The wind howled, amplifying her hesitation, but then Shadow let out a silent shudder, his head dipping as if in resignation, a subtle sign that tipped the scale, empathy overriding fear, her resolve cracking like the thunder above. Lina's hesitation shattered like glass under the storm's roar, her body moving before her mind could protest, a messy impulse born from the raw pull in Shadow's eyes. She shrugged off her sodden jacket, the fabric heavy as regret, and draped it clumsily over the trembling dog, her hands fumbling in the wind-whipped rain that stung her skin like accusations. Shadow flinched at first, his body rigid as a coiled spring muscles twitching under the makeshift shelter, but he didn't bolt. His mute form held still, a tentative acceptance that marked the irreversible shift from stranger to reluctant guardian. Lina whispered nonsense words, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "It's okay, boy, just come on." Her actions imperfect, fingers slipping on his wet fur as she coaxed him toward the alley's mouth, the gesture a bridge across their shared abyss. The dog's eyes met hers in that moment, a flicker of something beyond fear sealing the commitment in the chaos, a bond forged not in perfection, but in the desperate authenticity of reaching out. With Shadow trailing hesitantly behind his paws, splashing through the flooding alley like reluctant confessions, Lina led him to her apartment's dim threshold, the door creaking open like a sigh of surrender. Inside the space was a cocoon of muted light from a single bulb, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and leftover coffee, a far cry from the storm's fury but echoing their inner tempests. She offered a bowl of water, first setting it down with deliberate slowness, her eyes averted to give him space while Shadow circled warily, sniffing the air laced with her unfamiliar yet somehow resonant presence. He lapped tentatively, his scarred throat working silently, a small concession that whispered of budding trust. Lina sat on the floor nearby, not pushing, just being a quiet promise etched in her steady gaze. As the rain drummed against the window like forgotten memories knocking, Shadow settled in a corner, his body relaxing fractionally, the fragile bond taking root in mutual vulnerability. A silent vow that in this shared shelter, healing might begin to mend their fractured worlds. In the muted hush of Lina's apartment, where the rain's rhythm against the windowpane mimicked a hesitant heartbeat, Shadow claimed a dim corner like a sentinel guarding forgotten ruins. His body still damp from the storm curled into a tight ball, scarred fur bristling at every creak of the floorboards, his eyes pools of wary amber tracking Lina's movements with the precision of one who had learned that closeness invited pain. She moved with deliberate slowness, unpacking her piano and setting it aside, her own guarded heart echoing his distance. She avoided direct stares, offering only peripheral glances that spoke of respect for boundaries etched by betrayal. The air hung thick with unspoken tension, scented by wet dog and stale coffee, a shared silence that neither breached Shadow's mute presence, a heavy veil. Lina's soft sighs the only punctuation in the quiet. She sat across the room, knees drawn up, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the worn carpet, mirroring his coiled form, their mutual reticence a fragile truce, where trust was a distant horizon, not forced, but allowed to simmer in the shadows between them. As evening deepened, casting elongated shadows across the apartment's sparse furnishings, Lina rose quietly, her movements a whisper against the floor, and prepared a simple meal from her meager pantry, scraps of bread and canned meat, the scents wafting like tentative invitations. She portioned out a share for Shadow, placing the bowl midway between them, not too close to invade his sanctuary, her eyes averted in deference to his wariness. He watched from his corner ears twitching at the clink of metal, his body tense as if the offering were a trap veiled in kindness. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the city, their shared wounds surfacing in mirrored hesitations, Lina's hands trembling slightly as she ate alone, memories of orphanage meals, eaten in isolation flooding back, while Shadow's nostrils flared, inhaling the aroma that stirred echoes of sparse feeds during his street-bound days. Finally, hunger overrode caution. He crept forward on silent paws, his gaze never leaving her, lapping at the food with cautious flicks of his tongue, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence. In that moment, their unspoken pains intertwined the meal, a bridge over the chasm of mistrust, his watchful eyes softening fractionally as she hummed a fragment of the melody under her breath, drawing him into the quiet orbit of mutual suffering. The apartment's quiet was shattered by the accidental clatter of a mug slipping from Lina's grasp, crashing to the floor in a spray of ceramic shards that glinted like fractured memories under the dim light. Shadow froze, his body locking into stillness, eyes glazing over as the sound catapulted him back. Flashes of the warehouse raid gunfire popping like breaking glass, the melody blaring over speakers as children wailed and leashes snapped taut, his throat burning from the blow that stole his voice forever. Lina knelt to gather the pieces, her own mind reeling. The sharp crack echoed the slamming doors of the orphanage nights when the tune played faintly from a radio in the hall, a signal she now sensed tied to her abduction, stirring images of rough hands and dark vans that she'd buried deep. As she swept the debris, her hand brushed near Shadow, who didn't recoil but paused, his breath syncing with hers in a shared rhythm of resurfacing pain, the gesture a silent tether pulling their traumas into alignment. In that vulnerable pause, emotional threads wove tighter, the broken mug a catalyst for recognition, where without words they acknowledged the other's ghosts, the bond deepening through the quiet acceptance of wounds laid bare. As twilight filtered through the rain-streaked window, casting a soft amber glow across the apartment's worn floors, Lina sat at her piano, her fingers tentatively softening the haunting melody into a gentler variation, notes floating like tentative olive branches in the still air. Shadow from his corner lifted his head, ears perking not in alarm, but curiosity, his scarred body uncoiling slightly as the music wrapped around him like a warm blanket against the chill of memory. She noticed his shift, a rare smile tugging at her lips, the first genuine one in months, breaking through her numbness like sunlight piercing clouds, her heart flickering with an unfamiliar warmth that chased the shadows from her chest. He inched closer, paws patting softly, settling a few feet away, his eyes softening as he lay down the tension in his frame, easing into relaxation, a subtle playfulness emerging as his tail thumped once faintly against the floor. Lina laughed quietly, a sound rusty from disuse, reaching out to offer a treat from her pocket, which he accepted without hesitation, the moment igniting a spark of joy that transformed the space. The apartment no longer a cell of solitude, but a haven, where small gestures kindled hope, their bond warming like embers stirring to life. Moonlight slanted through the apartment's grimy window, painting silver streaks across the floor like pathways to unspoken revelations, as Lina sat cross-legged at her piano, silent for the first time in hours, the air thick with the residue of their shared quiet. Shadow, who had lingered at the room's edge like a specter reluctant to cross into the light, shifted his paws, scraping faintly against the wood, a sound that jolted Lina's heart into a stutter. He approached with deliberate slowness, each step a surrender, his scarred muzzle dipping low as if testing the invisible barrier between them. His eyes, once veiled in distrust, now held a vulnerable gleam reflecting the fragments of trust pieced together from scraps of kindness. Lina held her breath, her body statue still, as he closed the distance, resting his heavy head on her knee, with a weight that carried years of isolation, his warm breath fanning her skin like a sigh of release. Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden, and hot tracing paths down her cheeks as the dam of her guarded heart cracked wide, emotions flooding in relief, fear, a profound connection that mirrored her own orphan's longing for belonging. In that intimate contact, Shadow's body relaxed fully, leaning into her touch as she tentatively stroked his fur, the scars under her fingers a map of shared survival. It was a seismic shift, his initiative a mute declaration of surrender, binding them in a bond that promised to confront the shadows together. From her pocket slipped a crumpled card, Officer Trans, with a scribbled note about an old case falling like a clue from fate, hinting at the deeper mysteries their union would unearth. But for now the moment was pure, a silent vow etched in the quiet surrender of two broken souls, finding solace in each other. The apartment's fragile peace fractured subtly as night deepened the city's ambient hum, infiltrating like an unwelcome whisper, stirring Shadow from his newfound repose beside Lina. He rose abruptly, body rigid as a bowstring, his mute form vibrating with an internal growl that she felt more than heard, a low tremor rippling through the floorboards. His ears swiveled toward the window, hackles rising in slow waves, eyes fixed on the darkened pane, where rain pattered like coded messages from the past. Lina noticed the shift, her own skin prickling as if the air had thickened with unspoken dread. A distant sound, perhaps footsteps echoing in the alley below, or the faint strain of a melody carried on the wind, heightened his alertness. His posture, a primal sentinel tail, stiff and unmoving. The tension coiled gradually, transforming their sanctuary into a stage of subtle unease. Shadow's instincts flaring like embers reignited, foreshadowing the resurgence of traumas long buried but never extinguished. The tension in the apartment thickened like fog rolling in from the bay. Shadow's silent vigilance, a harbinger that set Lina's nerves alight, her fingers absently stroking his fur as she peered out the window into the rain-veiled night. Suddenly from the street below, a busker's piano struck up the haunting melody, the exact tune notes piercing the glass like shards of buried glass resurfacing. Shadow erupted in mute fury, his body launching forward with a force that upended Lina's small table, the crash echoing like the raid's chaos reborn. His jaws snapped at empty air, eyes wild with recognition, protective aggression surging as memories flooded flashes of the trafficking warehouse children's cries, muffled by that signal tune, his failed lunge to protect them, leaving him scarred and voiceless. Lina shouted instinctively, "Shadow, no!" her voice cracking with panic, her own trauma igniting like dry tinder. The melody clawed at her mind, dragging forth suppressed images of her abduction. The dark van, rough hands, the same notes playing on a radio as a code for capture her body, trembling heart pounding in sync with his silent snarls. Officer Tran, drawn by chance or fate while patrolling nearby, heard the commotion and knocked his knock a jolt that pierced the haze. He entered to find them amid the wreckage, Shadow's stance fiercely guarding Lina, revealing glimpses of the dog's role in the botched mission, and her unwitting link as the survivor, their shared explosion. A raw unveiling of pains, intertwined emotions boiling over in shouts and silent roars that bound them deeper in mutual revelation. The apartment door hung ajar from Tran's entry, a sliver of the outside world intruding like a crack in fragile armor as Lina and Shadow panted in the aftermath. The overturned table a symbol of their shattered calm. Then a figure materialized in the hallway's dim light. A man with a gaunt face etched by years of shadows, his eyes narrowing in recognition as he hummed the melody softly, the notes slithering into the room like venomous tendrils. Shadow's reaction was instantaneous, his body a blur of black and tan fury hackles rising like spines on a cornered beast, a mute growl vibrating through his chest as primal memories surged the man, a mid-level trafficker from the ring, the one whose boot had crushed his throat during the raid, now standing there with a smirk that twisted like a knife in old wounds. Lina froze, her blood turning to ice. Flashbacks assaulted her, the same man, younger but unmistakable, hauling her into the van as a child, the tune his signal to Confederates, her escape a fluke that left her as the sole survivor he'd hunted in whispers ever since. "You," she whispered, voice laced with terror and rage as the man stepped forward, his presence a tangible threat, words dripping with mockery. "Thought I'd lost that tune's echo, but here you are with my old mutt." Tran, sensing the escalation, drew his badge, his own guilt flaring ties to the cold case where corruption had let this abuser slip away. But Shadow lunged first, teeth bared in silent defiance, forcing the man back in a tense standoff, bodies locked in a dance of imminent violence. The air crackled with electricity, sensory overload of sweat-scented fear and the man's cologne mingling with rain. Lina's hands clenching as she grabbed a nearby lamp for defense. The confrontation. A powder keg where past and present collided, emotional stakes skyrocketing in a whirlwind of accusations and silent vows of protection. The apartment door slammed shut behind the retreating trafficker, his threats lingering in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire as Tran holstered his weapon, his face etched with the ghosts of unresolved cases, the room now a disheveled battlefield of overturned furniture and shattered calm. Lina sank to the floor, knees buckling under the weight of revelation, her survival not chance but a thread in a web of horrors, the melody, a siren's call that had nearly reclaimed her. Shadow pressed against her side, his scarred body a warm anchor, mute vibrations of reassurance humming through his chest as she buried her fingers in his fur, each stroke a tactile promise. "I won't let go, we'll face this shadow together." Tears streaked her cheeks, internal whispers of fear mingling with a budding resolve, her mind replaying the standoff. The man's eyes widening at Shadow's lunge, Tran's authoritative voice cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. Tran knelt beside them, pulling faded files from his coat. Yellowed pages spilling secrets, the tune as the ring's coded signal. Shadow's role in the failed raid documented in clinical notes. Lina's blurred photo as the escaped child circled in red ink. "This ends now." Tran murmured, his guilt softening into determination, the documents a bridge to closure, linking their fractured histories in ink and regret. Shadow's head lifted, eyes meeting Lina's in a silent vow, his presence a balm that reaffirmed their bond, trust, rebuilt in the quiet aftermath, a promise of safety woven through touch and gaze, sealing the traumatic chapter with the quiet strength of survivors united. The city's underbelly loomed as Lina, Shadow, and Tran approached the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts, a hulking skeleton of rusted metal and shattered windows that squatted under a moonless sky, its silhouette a cinematic omen of buried sins. Lina's hands clutched Tran's case notes, pages fluttering in the chill wind, like whispers of the damned, her pulse a staccato rhythm echoing the drip-drip of rainwater from overhanging eaves, each drop a countdown to confrontation. Shadow led the way, his instincts razor-sharp body low and tense as a drawn bowstring, ears pivoting at every rustle, the scuttle of rats in the underbrush, the faint creak of settling beams that mimicked footsteps stalking their trail. Internally, Lina's mind raced, fragments of memory surfacing like bubbles in dark water. The van's doors slamming, the melody's insidious hum over static radios, her young self curling into shadows much like these. Fear coiled in her gut, but Shadow's vigilant gaze grounded her. His mute signals, a paused step, a stiffened tail telegraphing danger before it materialized. Tran scanned the perimeter, flashlight beams slicing through the gloom like a hesitant blade, illuminating graffiti-scarred walls that seemed to breathe with the weight of past atrocities, the air thick with the metallic tang of decay, and something sharper like anticipation laced with dread. Subtle signs mounted: a discarded cigarette butt, still smoldering, whispers of voices carried on the breeze that could be wind or watchers. Shadow's hackles rising in silent alarm, his body language a primal Morse code warning of the hunted becoming the hunters. As they neared the entrance, boarded up but ajar like a half-healed wound, the tension thickened into a palpable shroud. Instincts flaring, signals accumulating in the sensory haze, watchfulness their only shield against the encroaching threat. The echo of the trafficker's footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving the apartment steeped in a silence so thick it pressed against Lina's skin like a shroud, the air still charged with the scent of adrenaline and rain-soaked fear. She slid down the wall, knees buckling as regret crashed over her in waves. Regret for the years she'd played that melody without questioning its hold, for the innocence she'd lost and the survivor she'd become, hardened, yet fragile, always one note away from unraveling. Shadow, his body still trembling from the confrontation, hesitated at first, his instincts pulling him toward the corner where shadows offered familiar solace, a physical separation that mirrored the emotional chasm yawning inside her. But then, as if sensing her descent into isolation, he turned, padding softly across the scuffed floor, his scarred paws leaving faint wet prints like trails of unspoken apology. The warehouse loomed on the city's fringe like a forgotten relic, its corrugated walls scarred by time and graffiti that twisted like veins under the pallid glow of distant street lamps, the air thick with the metallic bite of rust and the faint acrid whisper of old oil spills. Lina's breath came in shallow puffs, visible in the chill night, as she clutched Tran's arm, the case notes rustling in her pocket like dry leaves heralding an approaching storm. Shadow led his nose to the ground body, a taut wire of vigilance, ears swiveling at every subtle shift, the crunch of gravel under unseen feet, the rustle of wind through broken panes that could be breath-held in hiding. Internally, Lina's mind raced, flashbacks flickering like faulty film reels. The trafficker's smirk, the melody's insidious curl. Her child self huddled in similar darkness, fear gnawing at her resolve, but fueled by the fire of reclamation. The warehouse door groaned open like a beast awakening, spilling Lina, Shadow, and Tran into a cavernous interior where dust motes danced in the flashlight's beam like frantic spirits fleeing the light. The melody erupted from a hidden speaker, warped and looping, a sonic noose tightening around their throats, the trafficker's signal now a taunt, echoing off rusted beams that creaked under invisible weight. Shadows peeled away to reveal the man and his cohorts, faces, gaunt masks illuminated by the glow of a makeshift radio, eyes gleaming with predatory recognition. The survivor, the mutt, and the failed cop. The leader sneered, his voice gravelly as the floor beneath them, a pistol glinting in his hand like a promise of finality. Lina's heart slammed against her ribs, internal screams echoing the child's cries from her memories. The van, the hands, the tuned ceiling, fates, her legs weakening, as if the ground itself pulled her toward collapse, breath ragged in the stale air, thick with oil and fear sweat. In the warehouse's suffocating grip, time stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap the trafficker's gun barrel inches from Lina's forehead, its cold steel a metaphor for the frozen terror locking her limbs. Her mind a whirlwind of choices, flee into the shadows that had hidden her for so long, or stand reclaiming the survivor she'd buried. Internal voices clashed, the orphan's whisper to hide the woman's roar to fight as Shadow, bloodied and staggering, rose with a determination that pierced her haze, his mute eyes locking onto hers, pleading and commanding. Not alone, Not this time. Tran groaned from the floor, hand inching toward his fallen weapon, his guilt transforming into resolve. But it was Lina who moved first, a decisive surge born from the bond they'd forged, her hand snatching a rusted pipe from the debris, swinging it with a cry that shattered the melody's hold, the clang against the gunman's arm echoing like liberation. The hospital room breathed in soft, measured sighs, the fluorescent lights dimmed to a gentle hum that bathed everything in a pale, forgiving glow, like moonlight filtering through a veil of clouds. Lina sat beside the bed where Shadow lay, his bandaged form rising and falling with shallow breaths, the sterile scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint earthy trace of his fur, a reminder of the warehouse's grit now washed away. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately unwrapping gauze with fingers that trembled only slightly, revealing the stitched wounds that marred his side, each one a testament to the lunge that had saved her, the blood now staunched, but the ache lingering in her chest like an echo of thunder long past. Days blurred into a steady rhythm in the apartment once more, the warehouse's echoes fading like distant thunder rolling away over the horizon, leaving Lina and Shadow to navigate the quiet aftermath where healing wove itself through the fabric of their shared silences. She moved with a deliberate tempo, her steps soft on the worn floorboards that creaked like old bones settling. Placing a bowl of water near his bed, a simple offering, the liquid rippling gently under the warm lamplight that cast golden halos around them, the scent of fresh bandages mingling with the comforting musk of his presence. Shadow's eyes, clearer now from the haze of recovery, lifted to meet hers, a prolonged gaze that held volumes unspoken gratitude in the subtle tilt of his head, forgiveness in the slow blink that mirrored her own weary lids, their interwoven emotions surfacing in the sensory warmth of fur against skin as she knelt beside him. Sunlight filtered through the apartment's window like a hesitant promise, casting elongated patterns on the floor where Lina sat at her piano, fingers poised over keys that no longer trembled with ghosts. Shadow lay beside her, his scarred head lifting unexpectedly, resting it against her thigh with a weight that carried the depth of their shared odyssey, warm fur against denim, a breath sinking in slow, unified rhythm, his amber eyes meeting hers in a gaze that released the last tendrils of fear like shadows dissolving at dawn. She played then not the haunting melody, but a new one, notes rising soft and unburdened her hands, moving with fluid grace, each keystroke a symbol of rebirth, the music weaving around them like a gentle current carrying away the debris of trauma. In that intimate motion, eyes locked, breath mingling, hands evoking harmony. Emotional floodgates opened quietly, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Not of sorrow, but catharsis, a profound release where trust bloomed fully, unfettered. Shadow rose, leaning into her, his presence a final powerful emblem of their bond, walking side by side toward the door into the city's cleansed rain, a quiet rebirth under open skies.